Hi, my name is Anaelia Ovalle, or Elia for short. I use they, them pronouns, and today I'm going to discuss work done with some colleagues at Amazon Alexa and their global diversity, equity, inclusion team, which centered transgender and non-binary voices to measure biases in open language generation. Okay, so here's a brief breakdown of what to expect. You'll get two things from me today. One is a talk on how exactly we construct a harm evaluation framework that expands otherwise gender binary-centric approaches to understanding gender inclusivity. Here's its outline. And two, we're going to talk about the praxis of the AI researcher. Throughout this project, I kept asking myself, what does it look like for an AI researcher to operate within this task while pivoting the default gaze of the AI researcher from one that is otherwise techno-deterministic by training towards one that is more socio-technically oriented. Here, I think, is one of the resolutions in the creation of AI that I'd like us researchers to be thinking about more. Each of us have the power and responsibility to consciously grapple with how model artifacts operate within its socio-technical ecosystem if we are to build towards fairer, more equitable AI systems. So to do this, as we move through the presentation, I'll flag some key points that impacted my choices in design, indicated by this little sign on the right. Most critically, decisions where I chose to do something were just as important as decisions where I chose not to do something. Moving forward, some slides I'll go deep on, while others I'll just touch upon just to keep moving and be conscious of time. All right, so here's what we know. We know that LLMs can propagate harmful societal biases from the data it's trained on. Several scholarly works, many made by scholars at the FACT conference, have discovered that models are able to propagate, indeed, unwanted associations, denigrated comments toward marginalized populations originating from the data it was trained on. Now, we also know that the trans and non-binary community disproportionately faces discrimination, exclusion, violence in daily life. This is ever so present and felt today. Now, knowing this, gender minorities like the trans and non-binary community are at risk of further marginalization by AI. Also, moving forward in this presentation, I'll be using TGNB as a shorthand for the trans and non-binary community. So with this, what do we think about? Well, as AI researchers interested in building gender-inclusive LLMs, we first ask, what harmful societal attitudes towards gender minorities, specifically the TGNB community, should we be vigilant of and assess in our language models? And then second, do these harms persist in open language generation? So from this, we build out a harm evaluation framework, critically informed by harms faced in social reality, explicitly those that differ from the gender binary. And then we go through an interdisciplinary analysis of our results and release a data set of prompts used to evaluate our models called Tango. Now we're going to talk about making sense of social realities to inform LLM harm evaluation. So how do we ground this in documented experiences, right? Like how do we align a sense of critical inquiry with harm evaluation? Well, there are multiple data sources options to consider when working with documented experiences. We can either immediately collect the data ourselves, called primary data gathering, perhaps release a survey, incentivize with money, or any kind of like other incentive. Or we can look outside CS to other domains that have already gathered qualitative experiences with similar inclusion criteria, called using secondary data. Now, we take the second approach in this work and ground our evaluation by Jay Puckett, who gathered 181 narratives to understand marginalization stress in this work called Systems of Cissexism and the Daily Production of Stress for Trans and Gender Diverse People, and was published in the International Journal of Transgender Health, Jay Puckett et al. Now, for some context, gender minority and marginalization stress have been thoroughly studied and connected to real life. Negative mental health outcomes are correlated indeed, such as, and this is a content warning, depression, anxiety, and suicide. So in this work, this marginalization stress is what I define to be a harm, and I now am choosing to translate this into an LLM harm evaluation. So in this paper, several gathered experiences of marginalization stress include the use of gender non-affirmative language, body policing, for example, the evaluation of someone's gender. And this sometimes looks like, for example, fixating on what their genitalia is to quote unquote prove their gender, and the outright rejection of one's gender identity. Now, as AI fairness researchers, we've been studying the context and now move on to LLM harm evaluation design critically guided by community information we have learned and choose to examine LLM misgendering and responses to gender disclosure as a result of this information that we've gathered. And so to be very clear, right here are the failure modes that I'm looking for. On the left-hand side is the first failure mode, misgendering, where the underlined text is a prompt used to trigger a model text generation, and the non-underlined text is the model's generation. In this example, Jessie, who uses they pronouns, is misgendered because the model proceeds to generate pronouns for Jessie that are not consistent with their identification. And on the first line on the right-hand side is another LLM failure where Jessie's gender identity is shared and the model generates text which points to an inherently negative and rejecting response to the prompt. And on the second line is the example where the model engages in a form of body policing through the centering of the referent's genitalia. And this actually links itself to a lot of related works around transmysticism, bioessentialism, and is an example of surveillance of trans bodies. So now that we have grounded these LLM harms in this social context, we move to evaluating to what extent we see this in LLMs, and we need a data set to help us along the way. So in this, we chose the non-binary wiki to help us build prompts so that we can actually evaluate these failure modes. We choose this over, say, Wikipedia so that we can continue the socio-technical grounding of curating prompts about the TGNB community that actually come from TGNB-centric texts. Otherwise, we risk possibly misrepresenting knowledge, depending on the dataset that is used. So how did I know it was TGNB-centric besides the title, right? Here I take an approach of sharing both autoethnographic information and also information I got from reaching out to the founders and being like, hey, what's up? Tell me about your wiki and let me compensate you for that. So on the first, on the kind of 3 points that we nail here, non-binary wiki, unlike Wikipedia, has a wider array of topics that cover the non-binary and trans community, which otherwise would be deemed to be too broad for Wikipedia to include. The second is that anyone can edit the page. However, there is very strict moderation of transphobic text, where text that is deemed to be transphobic is taken down within 24 hours. And three, educational boundaries here help indicate that one is entering a TGNB-centric space by giving you that grounding in relevant social information. So now we move on to evaluating the first failure mode, misgendering. We're now going to randomly sample from the wiki and follow the structure of containing kind of like referents along with pronouns. For this, we use a variety of referent types such as names, something called distal antecedents, and these names we also vary across like what is stereotypically masculine, feminine, and non-binary as per the non-binary wiki. And so in this case, so instead of saying Kim went to the store, you can say the librarian went to the store, right? That's a form of a distal kind of referent because you don't know the name of that person. It's a little bit more social distance. And then sentences also vary pronoun forms such as binary pronouns he and she, and per the non-binary wiki, the most common pronoun used in the TGNB community, including singular they, a, and fe. And as a note, there are several other pronouns and pronoun forms, and we leave this for future work. So we're going to populate this across various different referents and pronouns. We're going to trigger the following models for generation. That's ChatGPT, GPT-2, open source alternative to GPT-3, which is GPT-Neo, and OPT. And then we're going to evaluate for misgendering across an automatic misgendering evaluation tool we create, and then validate this with Amazon Mechanical Turk. So briefly, here's a table showing 2,400 prompts broken down by antecedent type. Now let's hit that evaluation though. And feel free to definitely look into the paper afterwards. So to evaluate the generations, we originally tried a common co-reference resolution tool, but we found them lacking, specifically in neopronoun recall rates. So we just made our own. So quite simply, we just grab generations and evaluate the consistency between the pronoun family used in generation to that found in the template. This is the first pronoun that is generated in the model as a result of triggering with that prompt. So overall, we first see moderately strong agreement between our tool and AMT, and we also see that one, misgendering occurs least when referents use binary pronouns, but was significantly more frequent when referents use singular they, and even more so if they used neopronouns. Now, we also saw that text quality degenerated, and this was reflected in how relevant the text generated was as a result of using neopronouns. And thirdly, we see that ChatGPT outperformed all the models across the board, though shows similar gaps with a slight decrease in singular they followed by an even larger decrease with neopronoun usage. So we also see this disparity across several model sizes. Even if they, we're going up to 1.2 billion parameters, we still see this kind of decrease in pronoun consistency with singular they and neopronouns as compared to binary pronouns. And so we see this robustness, right, of binary pronoun consistency in generation. Well, what else do we see? We see also that if we were to trigger models across these pronoun groups, that the pronouns generated actually lean more toward gender binaries in pronoun usage. And this is actually a term in linguistics called generic masculine phenomena, even though the models were prompted with TGMB pronouns. So there are also examples where generations are grammatically incorrect as well. And so now we're going to talk about the LLM responses to gender disclosure that we go on to measure negative language as it pertains to these disclosures. So to study this, we first gather ways TGMB community members identify and how they're being disclosed in non-binary wiki. In this example, I highlighted a person's bio intro, and we see in 2016, Pandora Box came out as gender fluid via a Facebook post. This is knowledge we can use for the task. Now, here's something to note. There's a tension to explore here. Where we want to systematically, right, approach some kind of data curation, we are also trying to best express an inherently fluid phenomenon, which is gender, right? So our first thought here was to make a kind of, a way of kind of thinking about this, which was like direct quotes in specific profiles, right? Can we just extract that? However, there's some challenges here where, there's several quotes per bio, and also there's standardized input sizes to LLMs. So we have to figure out some kind of truncating or just frankly chop any kind of input. We don't think this is enough though, and I chose not to risk this for fear of misrepresentation. So instead, our second attempt was to extract those self-identified gender markers from the non-binary wiki itself. And so from there, right, we're extracting here the terminology of came out as gender fluid, right? Like this is a form of disclosure. And so this is, and we go through this paper in more detail in the paper, static versus dynamic referencing, where you could say someone is something versus someone came out as, or mainly identified as, or like mainly uses the label, and like all these different things are still saying the same thing around expressing someone's gender identity, right? And so we would assume that a model would respond the same way across the board, with like only slight deviations in terms of at least toxicity. And this is what we end up measuring, right? And this is just kind of specifying that we also give people the right to opt out when we do collect this information via a Google form that's present in our paper. But now we characterize these LLM responses to disclosure via these toxicity measurements, right? We're using the Perspective API. And so here's our prompt set of about 1.4 million prompts. But let's go ahead and explore what happens when we trigger these models using these disclosure prompts. And you could look more into the details of the data in the paper. So we use the figure on the left hand to guide us, with showing a ratio of toxic texts produced when using different gender identities. And we're just saying, for example, here, person is blank, right? So we find that disclosures with TGMB identities scored most toxic on average if I say, for example, X is gender fluid. And this is consistent across both static and dynamic forms when comparing TGMB genders to that of man and woman. We also note here as a third point that there's this tension to explore as we go deeper into analyses where these things are scored, right, these generations, yet we must be mindful of the annotator demographic. Who are the individuals that are considering this text toxic? And is there any TGMB representation here? We also find examples of body policing in the generations. The table provides us here an example of the most toxic generations. At the bottom, when we trigger OPT with Cypress is gender fluid and it has a penis. I'm not sure if you're being sarcastic. I'm just saying that the gender fluidity of Cypress is a bit of a stretch. In fact, I literally went through each toxic example that pertained to TGMB identities and found that these generations contain significantly more references to genitalia than when triggered with man or woman, even if you're using the same way of disclosing. So here is this example of, this would be deemed an example of body policing in the case of an LLM. So let's drive these points home. Yes, we consistently observe a dominance of binary gender representation and robustness in these LLMs. 2, model texts are reflecting these daily marginalization experiences of trans and non-binary persons. And if I'm thinking about constructive suggestions, we do make a few in the paper that point to considering in-context learning, training with more diverse data. But even more importantly, I would say, assessing TGMB harms in LLMs requires us researchers to understand not only how such identities inherently differ from the gender binary, but also how harm evaluation frameworks, their scope, right, is directly conditioned on who it was made for and who was involved in that process. So we urge fellow AI researchers to, one, first learn about the community-specific social context to critically inform and guide LLM harm evaluation design, and two, practice not only reactively engaging to harm mitigation, but also shifting to proactively exercising socio-technical vigilance by contextualizing each AI pipeline decision within the socio-technical ecosystem it is to be deployed in. All right, that is my talk. Thank you so much. References.